When we hear the word church, I think that's probably what we picture. We picture a guy in a cheap suit with bad audio talking about who knows what, using words that predate Shakespeare. And the reason we picture that is because according to Phil Zuckerman of Psychology Today, half of all Canadians seldom or never go to church. So we have this picture in our head of what church looks like, but half of us seldom or never experience it personally. And that's because we live in a post-Christian culture. Now let me show you. This map here, I couldn't find any Canadian data, but this map shows the top 10 most post-Christian cities in the US. Take a look at where they are. Most of them are right on the Canadian border. So that's us. So what is post-Christian? What is a post-Christian culture? Well, I'm glad you asked. John Sullivan of the National Review, he defines it as not only a culture that doesn't believe in God, but a culture that was rooted in Christian history and beliefs and values and has now rejected it or just forgotten about it. So picture my wife. We've been married for 13 years. She comes up to me tomorrow and says, you know what? I know we've always agreed on these things. We've always been on the same page, but I'm just not anymore. And she leaves. How much harder is it going to be for me to get her back, to reach her with the history we have now? That's what the church is dealing with. How to reach a culture, a post-Christian culture that has moved on. George Robinson wrote this great article called Bow Ties and Blue Jeans. And in it, he lists 5 suggestions for the church on how to reach this culture that's moved on, this post-Christian culture. So I'm going to highlight 3 of his. I'm going to add 1 of my own. So it's only 4 points, so stay with me. And the first point is this. The church must begin by answering the universal questions. The church must begin by answering questions people are actually asking. I think far too often the church will answer questions on predestination and what does the white horse in Revelation signify and who is the Antichrist. And people looking from the outside in, people that aren't attending church, that are looking in, are saying, I don't care. I don't care. What are we even talking about here? I don't care. And it doesn't matter if you've got this great ending, if you've got this great crescendo to your sermon, because you will lose them in the first 5 minutes. Neil Bradbury did a lit review on student attention span. And what he found was when it comes to direct observation, so I'm a student sitting in class observing a professor, or to put it in church terms, I'm a member sitting in a pew observing a preacher, he found that attention is lost in the first 5 minutes. The first 5 minutes. So that's great. You've got this beautiful point at the end of your sermon. If you're talking about something I don't care about, if you're answering questions I don't even have, you've lost me in the first 5 minutes because I don't care. I don't care. So the church has to be answering the universal questions. The church has to be answering questions that people actually have. And remember, there's this history between the church and the culture because we're in a post-Christian culture. So there's a history there. The culture has moved on from the church. So if we go back to the illustration of my wife and I, if she's moved on from me and she's got all these questions and I'm giving her answers that have nothing to do with the questions she has, she's going to think that I don't care. She's going to think that I'm hiding something. So that's what it looks like to a post-Christian culture when the church is talking about things that just don't matter to them. Mark Clark is a pastor of Village Church in Surrey, BC, and he does a great job of answering the questions that people have. He does a great job of starting with the universal questions.
Hasn't our study of science disproved the existence of God finally? We know when the universe began. 15 billion years ago. Big Bang, all time, all energy, all space, all matter in an instant. And everything came into existence. Hence, we don't need God. Is that true? So what are the top 10 skeptical challenges that people wage against Christianity? This book is an exploration of the answers I found that actually reframe all of those issues to show that Christianity is not only the most truthful, but the most hopeful in the marketplace of ideas.
You see how he's not shying away from the big questions about God, the big questions about the church. He's going after it. Point number one, the church has to begin with universal questions. The church has to answer questions people are actually asking. Point number two is this. The church must become compelling storytellers. The church must become compelling storytellers. And not only because it draws you in. I mean, a good story will draw you in. It will catch your attention quick. But according to Susan Weinschenk of Psychology Today, a story will light up your brain. If you hear somebody telling a story, your brain will light up. And the more compelling the story is, the more excited your brain is. So I can tell you a story about Christmas morning and how we got my son a bike for Christmas and he was pretty happy. And I mean, it's a story, so your brain will light up a little bit. But if I go into detail, if I make it compelling, if I tell you about the smell of the pine tree because it was a real tree, and how the lights were twinkling because the lights were dimmed in the room and the tree lights were twinkling and they were white lights and it was so beautiful, and the wrapping paper around that bike was sparkly and it was red. And if I make that story compelling and I describe the look on his face, that's going to excite your brain more. The church must become compelling storytellers. The church does a pretty good job at engaging people physically with a handshake or eye contact or a hello. The church needs to engage people psychologically. We already know, we've talked about it. You lose people in that first 5 minutes. So use that time right at the beginning to engage their mind. Bring them on a journey.
So we have this little string and it has all these bells on it and it's attached to my door. And so anytime you open the door, it rings, right? So I'm in our house and I'm sitting there reading my notes and it's dead silent in my house. And all that I heard were these bells. And I looked over and there was no one there. And I'm like, what's going on right now? And I kind of went, okay, I'm going to ignore this. Now I'm freaking out because I think, oh my gosh, I got a ghost in my house, all right? Because here's what the explanation for those bells ringing can't be. It's not nothing, right? We agree with that. It can't be nothing. There has to be some explanation, whether there's an earthquake happening right now, whether my kids are crawling around trying to scare me, ringing it, whether there's an actual ghost in my house ringing the bell to get I don't know, but there has to be, it can't be nothing. So I went to the door and I opened the latch, I'm like looking out, and then I opened the door and I went outside and my father-in-law, who's visiting right now, is sitting out on the deck reading. He's like, oh, sorry, I was trying to get in there. I'm like, thought you were a ghost, freaking me out, man. When are you leaving? Now, now remember, you and I are trying to be rational, reasonable, logical people. It would not suffice to say, here was this effect that happened, but there was no cause. Let's just not investigate it. Don't worry about it. Sure, something rang, something banged, energy, matter, everything came in. Yeah, but let's not talk about what actually caused it. What caused it was nothing. That's not the most, remember what we're trying to be, rational, reasonable explanation for the actual evidence.
So you see how he uses that story to draw you in, to get to the spiritual point that he's trying to make. See, in a culture that is post-Christian, a culture where those outside the church don't necessarily share the values and the beliefs of those inside the church, compelling stories can help you engage the outside psychologically and bring them to the spiritual point you're trying to make. That they won't necessarily just accept on its own. But if you are compelling in your storytelling in the church, you can get that spiritual point out to those who are in a post-Christian culture who don't share your beliefs. So point number 2, the church must become compelling storytellers. Point 3 is this: invitation does not equal evangelism. Robinson, in the Bow Ties and Blue Jeans article, talks about a lighthouse and how a lighthouse is only helpful to those who are looking for the shore. So an invitation, putting that light out there, is only helpful if somebody's looking for it. In the past, before we were in this culture of post-Christianity, it was good enough just to put out an invitation, because most people's beliefs and values were pretty much aligned with the church's. So to go to church wasn't much of a stretch. But now that this culture is post-Christian, those values don't mesh so easily. And it is a bit more of a stretch for somebody on the outside to come into the church. So invitation does not equal evangelism. It's not just good enough anymore if you're in the church to throw out an invitation. There's a study done at the University of Tennessee, and it showed that millennials and Gen Xers are more entitled than baby boomers. So as far as entitlement goes, we're headed in the wrong direction. So now you're putting this invitation out to a post-Christian culture, so somebody who is against your beliefs, who has rejected your views, who has forgotten about your values, who's also entitled. So they want to be served. They think they are owed. And you expect them to come to your church because you said, hey, you should come to my church. See, that's not good enough anymore. So how do you get this culture, this post-Christian culture, this entitled generation to come to your church? Well, some churches are saying you don't have to. Bring church to them. One of those churches is Church Home. Judah Smith is the lead pastor there.
What if we could deliver our church to people in the palm of their hand when they're in a condo at the ends of the earth, at the end of their rope, wondering if there is a God? Maybe they'll never step foot in a theater, but could we take God to them? Is that okay to suggest? We got to have church buildings now? That's a thing? When did that? I'm not against buildings. We have buildings. When was a band required? We will not be defined by the modern traditions of church.
See, he's saying, you don't need to come into my building in order to talk to a pastor, in order to get prayed for, in order to have community. You don't need to come to church. I'm going to bring church to you. See, invitation isn't good enough. It's not good enough to look at this post-Christian culture and say, hey, come to my church. I know we don't believe the same things. I know we don't practice the same things. I know you've rejected everything I'm about. But hey, just come on. That's not good enough. You need to take church to the culture rather than expecting the culture to come to church. Invitation does not equal evangelism. That's the third point. And the last point is this: people need a purpose. People need a purpose. According to Rutten and all, people with a purpose are more satisfied in life. They have more meaning in life. People with a purpose, they are more psychologically healthy. And people with a purpose, it can actually help you live longer. See, people need a purpose. The church has to give people a reason to get up off the couch. The church has to give people a reason to follow what they're following. A culture that has turned away from the church is not going to turn back unless there is something to fight for, something to go after, something bigger than what they're doing with their life. And the church needs to point that out. If the people in the church are so passionate about this purpose, they need to tell their face so their face can tell somebody else that this is something worth living for. It's illustrated pretty well here by Judah Smith.
Only Jesus can keep you from a normal human plight, which is what? Work, 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 do, try, get, and yet what? I'm empty. I'm hollow. What's this all for? What's the purpose? What are we here for? Solomon said thousands of years ago, it's all vanity. And he had all the money and all the glory and all the girls, and he said it's all empty, meaningless, and vain. Isn't it, Solomon? Until Jesus. Because the architect, the designer, the maker of heaven and earth gave his life for the centerpiece of his creation, which is mankind. This is bigger than your career. This is bigger than your job. This is bigger than clothes and stuff and things and our social media. This is bigger. It's the point of it all. It's the cross.
People need to be a part of something bigger. They need a purpose. They need something bigger than Netflix and bigger than social media and bigger than news about lockdowns and COVID. If the church wants to reach a culture that has moved on, the church has to show this culture that they've got something bigger. They've got something worth living for. They've got something that will help you find purpose. So the church must begin with the universal questions. They must answer questions people are actually asking. The church must become compelling storytellers. You've got to draw people in psychologically to get them to your spiritual point. The church must realize that invitation isn't good enough. You've got to take church to the people. And the church must show people that they've got something worth living for because people need a purpose. If the church is going to reach a culture that has moved on, I believe those are 4 of the best ways to do that.